Ryan's going to show us some tools that we can use to make better Jamstack sites. And specifically, Ryan is going to be talking about Next.js and Vercel and making dynamic web applications that aren't just static content using a backend. So Ryan is another Turing graduate. Congratulations, Ryan actually just graduated a couple of weeks ago, which is really exciting. He has been messing around with React and Node a lot, and he's really excited about the Jamstack. So I'm really interested in hearing this. I know of Vercel, and I have no idea what it is. So I'm really excited to hear Ryan's talk. Ryan, go ahead and take it away.
So, thank you. Okay, let's share this screen here. Y'all can see me and hear me. Sweet. Cool. Yeah, I'm Ryan, and we're going to talk about Jamstack in the context of Next and Vercel. So what we're going to be talking about is a quick intro to the platforms and tools that we're going to be using. And then we're going to dive into some interesting stability and performance benefits that you may not have thought about within the context of Jamstack. And then we're going to be diving into some examples that will hopefully build upon each other, and then go into some challenges and talk a little bit about like what the future of these tools and ideas like might be moving towards. So let's dive in. So Next.js is a UI framework for web apps. It's built with React, Node, and Webpack under the hood, but a really nice benefit is that like 99.9% of the code that you're going to write is going to be React and plain JavaScript. It supports static site generation, server-side rendering, and client-side rendering on a per-page basis. And we're actually going to see in the examples that we can actually mix these up as well. Out of the box, it supports CSS and JS. It actually has its own called JSX. I haven't used that as much, so I'm not going to talk about that as much in this talk because I mainly use styled components, but it is a really nice tool that's available, and it works very well. It also supports TypeScript and Sass right out of the box. And it has its own routing. It's file system based routing, and we're going to see this later on as well. But basically, you will have a top level pages directory, and by defining folders and files in there, that's where your routing is actually going to happen. And then as part of that, it has link prefetching, which is like a very popular Gatsby feature as well. And the way that this works is with a guest.js, not just J, where there's machine learning under the hood that actually sort of tracks like what the most popular routes to your site are and prefetches the most popular pages. It also has automatic code splitting, and this is handled through Webpack, and it's done actually through the file system-based routing. So all of those individual pages are going to get bundled up into small bundles that can get served so that we like dramatically reduce the size of the code that actually has to ship for each request. And then one of the most interesting new features is now there's automatic static optimization. And what this essentially means is that even if you don't tell Next.js to render something on the server or generate something statically, it's actually going to look at the code that you write, and any availability of essentially JavaScript that doesn't need to be rendered on the client, any HTML that's packed in your React components will just get statically rendered. So each of your pages can have metadata and SEO, and there's going to be a lot that's like a skeleton already there without you having to do anything at all to implement this feature, which is really, really nice. And then there's Vercel. This was formerly called Zeit, Z-E-I-T, and this is the company that created Next.js. So they primarily are a hosting service and global CDN, I believe built on top of AWS. And they have a ton of extra functionality and features that are really, really nice. I think my favorite right now is preview deploys. So what this means is that if you have like a Git repository, let's say you're on GitHub and you host your site on Vercel, anytime you push up a PR on a branch, it's going to automatically like deploy your site to a domain that you can go look at sort of like in prod. So you have this like extra layer of staging environment that you don't even need to do anything to set up. And then it's also going to have your typical like triggered deploys where when you push to master, your whole site can rebuild. And you can also set this up with a webhook to where like if you have CI pipeline, then it'll be the last thing that happens. You also have access to serverless functions and custom DNS. And it kind of goes from super simple to just like buying a domain through Vercel and having it automatically generate an SSL and be on your app, to sort of as configurable as you want it to be. So let's talk about quickly like the opinions that like this framework and platform has, because I think a very important part of UI frameworks as they're defined is like, what are the opinions that drove this? So the first one that I think has been a newer transition for Next.js is full extensibility. So what that means is that you're going to get these really, really nice defaults that we just talked about, but Webpack and Babel will be fully configurable. You can extend the default app and document component and add in whatever you want. And largely they're moving towards this idea of like giving the best defaults possible for a great developer experience, and then letting people change that as needed as apps grow and scale. And I guess our ideas of Jamstack can grow and scale as well. Another part that we sort of touched on is that Next really wants you to pre-render and statically optimize as much as possible. So at any time, the framework is going to try to render things ahead of time as opposed to just in time. And then a really nice benefit for developers is that the language is just meant to be easy. It's meant to be like React plus some like candy on the side. So the developer experience is really great, and it's not at the behest of any UX or causing performance issues. It's actually the opposite. It's trying to increase performance to make sure that the user and the developer both have the best experience possible. It's also really embracing serverless a lot. There's a lot of support and interesting ideas around how Next and Vercel can be used with GraphQL and Apollo, or something like FaunaDB, or even like Recoil and Relay. They're really exploring a lot of new and interesting ideas, and sort of embracing this like serverless model, or this idea that the front ends can sort of take some of the back end responsibility and balance it out a little bit better. And then, like we mentioned before, file system based routing and bundling on a per page basis. So probably like a question you would think is like, why would we not use Gatsby? Like in what cases is it inappropriate to reach for Gatsby and to dive into Next.js? The first one is like, what if you don't know how your app and features will scale? Like, what if you're starting out making a blog, but then all of a sudden you want something that's like super interactive, or you want to implement some feature and you're at this like very early stage of just not knowing like what products or what features of your application are going to be the things that you end up growing more. Well, with Next.js, that's not an issue, because let's say we created the entire app statically, we can just get rid of that and replace it with either server-side rendering or client-side rendering whenever we want. And that problem is immediately solved. So we don't have nearly as much risk when we like lock ourselves into the vendor, because there's a lot more navigation and flexibility about how we can do things. Another, I think probably the most common example is like, what if you have a massive application that takes way too much time to rebuild? So like, what if you have a blog that has like 50,000 pieces of content on it? Now, when you create a new blog post, your entire application has to rebuild, and that's a ton of time that you need to now spend like making sure the deploy worked and monitoring that. Similarly, like what if your app is consistently updating all the time? You probably don't want to do so much static generation in that case. And then the final one is, what if you just want access to serverless functions and want to be able to do a little bit more than a traditional front end would provide you? This is like a really great case to use Next.js, because as we'll see in some examples, you basically get access to serverless functions in your front end as it's set up, without having to do too much extension of anything at all. So before we get into the examples, I just want to talk quickly as well about some performance benefits that you may not have thought about when considering using the Jamstack. So for one, when we talk about static pages and things being compiled at build time, which means like when you push something up and your application gets built and served out, everything gets de-risked, because if there's a breaking change, it's going to get caught at build time and not actually deploy. So this is a huge benefit. There have already been times when I've been working on some apps with Next.js where my CI pipeline works fine. And then there was something or another that causes the actual build to break, and my deploy doesn't go out. And that's amazing to have happen, because there's so much less risk of things on the client side going wrong. And sort of similarly, like the more we move things to server-side rendering, and the more we can statically generate at least parts of our application, the less logic we even have to ship out at all. So like our bundle size is smaller, and we, again, just reduce the risk of like all this client-side JavaScript that needs to execute. And one of the best parts of having this kind of mixed model is that we still have a client. Like we're not stuck doing everything on the server. So we can still retry fetch calls. We can fall back to other workers, or we can like look for cache data to like make sure that everything goes right as much as possible. Cool. So that was like a lot of conceptual stuff. So now I want to start with some really simple examples and show you like how we can sort of build dynamic applications using this model. So this is hilarious, and I didn't plan this either, but I'm also using the advice API for this. So like solidarity there. So this is the fetch call we're going to be using. It's called fetch advice. It just gets an advice slip like we are very familiar with. And yeah, let's get into it. So this would be your model of like client-side rendering. So we have a component called home. It's a functional component. And then we have a nice little hook of advice and set advice. And then we're using a use effect hook to call this get new advice function, which is just going to fetch something and then put it in our use state hook. And then that's going to generate into our application. And then, oh yeah, we also have a button down here that when we click it, it's going to get a new piece of advice. So we can see here that, okay, I just restarted. The GIF timing is weird. But we see actually that nothing is there. Then it loads up. We click. We get a new piece of advice. This is on the deployed app too. So this is a decent replication of the speed you would get. So what if we want to like server-side render that? So this is that exact same code, but now instead of rendering on the client, we're actually going to render the first call on the server, and then we're going to use that same button click event to generate new pieces of advice from the client. So we'll see this in the console later on with this, but we have down here this function, get server-side props, and this is how you're going to specify that you want Next.js to do something on the server. I'm not using this context object, but I wanted to show that it exists because there's like a bunch of cool features there too. I'm not going to get into that now, but basically we have this function, we do the same fetch call, and then we put it in our props, and you can see that we're going to access that right away. And so basically what's going to happen here is that the new advice prop is going to stay the same until the page hard refreshes, but we still have the same option of rendering things on the client. So we're going to see make choices and don't look back is the first thing. And if you look at the console, I know it's a little blurry here, but I'll share the example project later where you can actually take a look at this if you want. That first prop is never going to change even when the client side changes until the page hard refreshes, and then we'll fetch that again. And then finally, we have static generation. So this is going to be nearly exactly the same. The only difference, in fact, is that instead of get server-side props, we have get static props. So what this is going to tell Next.js is that when we go and deploy this application, it's going to build the app, it's going to do this fetch call, and then it's going to set it in the same manner. And then we can still change it on the client side. But the main difference is that this initial hardest things to say are usually the most important is never going to change. In this case, it sort of would, because when you rebuild the app, it'll redo the fetch call and get like a different piece of advice. But in a typical scenario, that's just not going to change. Cool. And then like another quick example. So if we consider an application structure that has both dynamic and static pieces, we can see that we have this top level, there's a pages directory, a public directory, and a source directory. So our source is going to have all of our React in the same way we've always known and loved it. Our public directory is going to have assets, and then we're going to have this pages directory. So I'm going to get into this API in a minute, but for now I want to talk about like what's so nice about having these options at our disposal. So consider a typical application that has, say, a marketing site and a blog, and then the actual like meat and potatoes app. Instead of having those with subdomains or something like that, we can actually specify an index page, so our marketing site, a blog, And our app, instead of being a subdomain, is just going to be a subfolder of this pages directory. So this syntax with brackets is actually how you would specify dynamic routes. So you can have dynamic routes still statically generated and everything works exactly the same. And in this case, provided you're not, you don't have like 50,000 blog posts, as we mentioned, you can have your entire blog be static and then have a ton of persistent dynamic functionality in your app. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot this. So with the API, this is actually where you're going to be defining your serverless functions. So as I mentioned that Node.js is involved in this, if you create an API route, anything inside of it is going to be the endpoints to your application. So in this case, and in the app that I'll show in just a moment that's fully dynamic, we have authorization happening through a serverless function where it's going to actually hit like mygreatestappofalltime.com/API/auth. And then we're going to be able to define routes in there that ultimately get called to serverless functions. So what this means right away, basically, is that you have just an immediate performance boost from the framework alone. Like you could take the same app that you wrote in Create React App, write it essentially identical in Next.js and have better performance, smaller bundles, less code that has to ship to the user. So this is like a great incremental step to have right out of the box. And then on top of that, you're going to be able to change the rendering of the rendering implementation of pages as we go. So let's say we have something on a deadline that we need to get built up. We can build things, have it be client side, do everything the way we're used to, and then piece by piece start changing these things over, start adding in that get server side props function or that get static props function and move along the way. Cool, so now I'm gonna share a quick video of a more dynamic application that was built using Next.js. The front end of this was co-built with Chris Postma, who I think might be in the chat. So shout out Chris, he's a wonderful person to work with and an extremely talented developer. And quick backstory in this. So this is basically a progress tracking app for stuff that you want to learn. It's called Learnable. You can take all those pesky tabs that you always have open when there's like 10,000 tabs in the browser and be able to like organize them into some playlists that might be more helpful. And this was built completely in Next.js on Vercel. All of the state that you're seeing persists. It works in the same way as any other application. This is sped up a little bit because I'm a slow typer, but this is like basically the speed that you're going to get with something like this. So you can have basically everything that you're still accustomed to. And then I'll just show some view switching towards the end. So yeah, you have basically all the CRUD functionality that you would want. And in a moment, I'm going to dive into how this functionality actually works, but a quick disclaimer on that is that Next does not play great with context API in some ways, and we're going to get into that. So this was sort of like a naive approach to doing this, where there's like certainly a lot more room for exploration, and state management is still one of the trickier things to deal with. So we'll get into that. But so this would be like a typical create setup. So all of the functions that you're going to see are within a context API that's basically acting as like sort of almost like a middleware between the API that we actually need to hit, which in this case was a Node and Express API that we built externally to this. So another service that we're consuming. And yeah, so the context API is going to kind of be like a filter between that API we're hitting and then the things that we're seeing. And in this case, we're doing that by splitting the functions in two, where we're basically immediately updating the local data and then syncing that back up with the remote data over time. So in this first add playlist function, we're just immediately when something gets clicked, we're going to make like a new shell of something to start working within. And then once we decide that like, okay, the user is not going to cancel this, like this actually is going to go to the server, we're going to have a separate post playlist function that's going to hit a server with the appropriate data and set the state, and then remove that like bare bones version that we had and replace it in the background with something new. In our read functionality, we're going to actually have a use effect hook inside of our context API so that like basically when the application loads up, we're going to check that like a session is happening. If there is a user logged in, we're going to fetch the playlist for that user. There's a small sorting function here that could probably happen elsewhere, but hey, and then we're going to set the state again. And we're going to do something very important if that doesn't go right. Update is very similar. It's just a patch request where we have a custom update function. So we're going to look through our context and just replace it in the background with the thing that we've gotten back. And destroy is very similar to our post, where we're going to first remove the playlist, and then we're going to update the server in the background and respond to that. And this out of the gate, all client side. Obviously, this is not an app at scale, but it gets you so far so quickly with the performance that immediately is helpful. So even with like limited use of server-side rendering and static site generation, the fact that so much of the skeleton HTML and CSS is already there, the fact that we're rendering all of our styles on the server, and that Next is providing us with so much optimization really goes such a long way. But of course, there are like still challenges and still pitfalls. One of them is that server-side rendering of styles is like, at least to me, super confusing, and there's very limited documentation on how to do it. So like in this case, we have to actually make a custom document, but we have to do this big mix of like getting our styled component styles, getting our material UI styles, and then just like a lot of like nesting of things. Given that like config like this is generally always painful, but it's still going to be a little bit painful when you get in the weeds of configuring your custom things or configuring a custom server, Webpack and Babel. Like that's not really an area that Next does a ton of help with. And then state management, something that's like really difficult on the front end. Using context was great, but I think one of the biggest challenges is that those functions that we looked at, get server-side props and get static props, those are going to be run completely away from context. So you won't be able to access your store in that case. I thought initially that we'd be able to do something like generate our context with like a big payload and then be able to pass that data from the payload back and forth between pages. And with context, that does get a little bit difficult. There's actually like a Redux wrapper that accomplishes this perfectly, where you can basically have a Redux store on your front end and your back end and access it from the server or from the client, which may certainly be something worth looking into. But in our use cases, like this top example is basically what kind of has to happen on a lot of pages is you're going to have a use context hook and you're going to render data on the client, unless you're doing like another fetch call, in which case you can use that get server side props to do that. But like persisting data between pages using context API, still a little bit challenging, and you can still get into a little bit of container stacking here, where even in a smaller application, like you're wrapping a lot of providers and a lot of extra things. And yeah, there's also a lot of interesting things happening with like Apollo GraphQL that seem to be in sort of the Redux realm as well, of being prioritized a little bit more. So I'll be interested to see where some of those goes. Other challenges, it is a smaller community. Getting answers is not going to be as easy as getting answers on like React generally, but there are definitely people there and people that are helpful. Lesser known features aren't that well documented right now. There's actually a lot more power to both Next and Vercel that you might not like find just in the docs. They do have like a huge repo of example projects, but you will have to look through those and kind of pick them apart, and they aren't extremely well commented or described, but they are set up well, but it is more work. And then writing universal React. So like writing React that can run on either the client or the server. So you're not going to have access to the window object. You're not going to have access to some of the nicer things that could possibly be a problem, say, if you're trying to get the base URL of what you're working with. There are some workarounds with that. Vercel provides some like response headers to do that, but things can be a little bit more complicated. Cool. So like, where is all of this going? I want to start with two things that I think have the possibility to completely change the way we think about Jamstack. And these are linked as well, and I'll be sharing these slides so that you guys can check this out if you're interested. But incremental building is something that was recently proposed in an experimental feature in Next.js, where we took that previous example of having a blog with, say, 50,000 pages. Like, the build time is just kind of crazy. Incremental building is this idea of actually being able to keep the build that you had and tack on your new information seamlessly, so that the 50,001st blog post is just going to get rendered and go right on to where you need it. And it's still experimental, and it seems like there's a decent amount of complexity to it right now. But if something like that could be adopted, if we had this ability to statically generate the majority of our application that didn't need to have like persistent client-side data, and then just incrementally add on what we wanted to, I think that's could be like a serious breaking point of like when this becomes something that scales hugely. And then kind of similar to that, there's a lot of work right now around like changing the way that like bundlers are working. One person in particular is Evan Wallace, the CTO of Figma, who's working on this project called ES Build, which is a bundler that in its experimental phases is something like 150 times faster than Webpack. The way that he's testing this right now is by taking the 3JS library, duplicating it 3 times, and then trying to bundle that. And I think the difference in bundling time was Webpack was somewhere at around a minute, and ES Build was at 55 milliseconds. So just sort of like unbelievable changes in time. And it's really interesting. You should definitely check it out. It's written in Go, and it's like way beyond my scope of understanding, but I'm super excited about that. And again, like if we can solve these problems, if we can solve the problem of long build times, I have a hard time believing that static generation won't catch on at scale, just because it reduces so much risk. It puts content at the edge. It makes it so that your users can get things so much faster. And then jumping into something that like has no speculation, but something that I'd like to see is some sort of like content editing graphical user interface. We're starting to see like things like Prismic and Contentful really catch on, and I think they're great ideas. But with something like static sites, I think there's a gap to be bridged in terms of like where we're at now and like some of the implicit benefits of something like Squarespace, where like I could build a Squarespace site and hand it off to someone and they could know how to use it. And I think that it would be really, really interesting to consider something like that for statically generated applications, where like Prismic and Contentful are kind of getting there, but you still need to have technical knowledge to use them. Like you could not hand one of those off to someone in marketing who doesn't have technical knowledge, or someone in sales, and expect them to like maintain something like that. And I think, at least I'm hoping, that we can see movement in that direction, because being able to hand off a React application or a Next or a Gatsby application to somebody and have some like methodology or manner of them being able to edit content afterwards without needing like your webmaster, I hope to see gain more prominence, because that will just increase the amount of things that can be built with these tools, and we'll be able to like leverage all the performance benefits that we get without having this huge gap between the people who are able to participate in these systems. And then finally, something that's not just like me speculating about what I'd like to see is like more packages in the larger community. There's a lot going on with people building things with Next.js. I'm going to talk about that right now, actually. I want to share as much as I can about these tools, because I really, really want people to be using them. I think they're awesome. And I think there's a lot of things, especially for people who might be, say, like newer to the Jamstack model. I think Next is the best way to like incrementally learn more and more and be able to implement more. So some of the tools that I'm highlighting right here, there is something called a use SWR hook, which was created by Next.js as well, which gives you a ton of options for fetching data, doing like automatic revalidation on focus, rehydrating things, as well as even persisting scroll position. There's Next PWA, which gives you a boilerplate to have like a complete progressive web app with a service worker and cache data like right out of the box. A brand new one is Next Auth 2.0, which is what I use to have serverless functions that do authentication, and you can check that authentication and protect routes either on the client or the server. Next page transitions for animation, and then a final link that somebody else in the Next community collected like a ton more packages and resources. And as well at the top, I have the example code from this talk that hopefully can get people up and running. And yeah, that's me talking like at length about Next.js and Vercel. Yeah, super excited about it. I think there's a ton of possibility.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. That was excellent. So, you having not used Next or Vercel myself, can you talk a little bit more about how Vercel's integrated with this? Because like I get the Next stuff. That's awesome. What is Vercel bringing? Is Vercel just like running the server side functions and that kind of stuff? What's the integration there?
Yeah, so Vercel mainly is going to, Next.js is doing most of the lifting in, and when you end up doing the bundling, the majority of what happens. Vercel is basically putting your stuff on their edge network, so you're basically going to have as much of like everything that got statically generated and all of your page skeletons are going to be now like on the edge, like pushed to the edge in all directions. And they also offer a lot of like custom response headers and like extra endpoints that you could hit. So like say your app is using Next and hosted on Vercel, you're going to get some extra built-in functionality when you're using serverless functions right out of the box. I think those are like the two main portions of it. Oh, actually, one more is that Vercel actually has a like smart detection of the framework that you're using. So when you pull something in from GitHub, I haven't tried this with many other things, but with a Next project, it's one-click deploy, like no config at all. With Create React App, it's one-click deploy, and they have a ton of other options that I have no reason to believe they don't work. So it basically is just handling that deployment process and configuring everything behind the scenes.
Okay, very cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
So first I want to read a comment from Yemitz, I think that's how you say his name. Vite.js by Evan Yu is a no bundling environment, which is quite interesting as well. We talked about those, so I think that one's heavily tied to Vue as well, so makes sense there. But Dan asks a question of, is Next.js pretty stable in terms of the framework / library, or is it evolving pretty quickly?
Sure. I would say it's evolving, but still stable in the sense that they're not making breaking changes as far as I've seen, and they're kind of building on top of things without making significant changes therein. So I would say sort of in the middle, maybe. Like I think, to my understanding, Next 9, which just recently came out, so this idea of like per page basis with static generation, server side and client side, that really all got introduced in Next.js 9, which was like a huge change. Before they were mainly like server-side rendering. So it was like Gatsby is for static sites, Next.js is for server-side, like let's move on and think about other things. And that change to 9 really added in a ton of new features, sort of the flexibility I was talking about. So given the way that happened and the support for the previous ways of doing things still being there, I would say the stability is there. And given how closely it is to just writing React, I don't think it would even be difficult to change to something else in many senses if you had to.
Nice. Yeah, I had no idea they were on version 9 already. It's pretty
Yeah.
insane. So I actually just kind of wanted to comment on like your point about like user interfaces or being able to hand things off to like a marketing team. One tool that I've actually talked about is called Tina CMS, which is kind of trying to do that. But it's right now it's heavily tied to like Markdown based content systems, and all their like API based like content management is pretty experimental right now. But there are some tools that are trying to, you know, get to that point where you could, in theory, hand something off to a team and just let them edit it as they need to.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. And a nice thing about Next as well with that like page system is that like you still would at a company have to like set up an environment for for somebody to like work. But if you had less technical people who still had some like HTML, CSS knowledge, or some designers
Yeah.
perhaps, like you could have your app and everything in your app set up with tons of components and complexity. And then your marketing site could pretty much just be HTML, CSS that someone could pop onto and change without risking
Right.
like breaking a ton of other things.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm not seeing any. Oh, there one just came in from Alice. What have you built or are you building that you're excited to use these tools for?
Sure. So the app like Learnable, that's something that we're trying to continue to build and to add in a bunch of interesting features on. So I think that's the main one right now because that's probably the best use case for mixing up a lot of dynamic functionality and a lot of static functionality. So definitely super excited for that. And also looking for contributors. So if anyone wants to work in Next and do some stuff, hit me up.
Nice. Yeah, was that link URL live to anyone to use?
So it's still closed for now. We're very close to making it live, but we want to switch from the context API for sort of the reasons
Gotcha. Yeah.
described. So trying to make that migration first.
Nice, because that is something I'm very interested in. I definitely have a whole like folder on my browser of just things I'm gonna look at later. So that would
Yeah,
definitely clean that up. Um, well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so thanks again for your talk there, Ryan.
sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.